cloud. Cool. And Isabel, if you're also able to do a recording as well as contingency, that would be excellent. So Peter, I'll pass to you to kick us off.
Yeah, so thank you. So just to hold the ring for a minute, really. Appreciate everybody's time and attention. Thank you so much for coming. Very, very welcome. And as our kind of preamble shows, it's going to be an interesting night. Lots of discussion, I think. Thank you to Isabel, Miguel, and Jonathan for establishing our new format, which we are working with today. And special thank you to David, who's joining us, David McLennan, an ARUP subject matter expert in global agricultural systems, and to Ioan Fazey, professor at York for social dimensions of environment and change. I wish I had that title, Ioan. That's fantastic. You're all very welcome, and let's see where we get to tonight, but I think we're probably onto something good with the way in which we're going to construct this event. Jonathan.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So the format today is Ioan and David will both present for target 12 minutes, but 50 minutes hard stop each. And then what we'll do, we'll go into breakout rooms. There won't be an awful lot of breakout rooms as there's just over a dozen of us. I expect 1 or 2 more people to join as the presentations progress. So we'll have conversation in breakout rooms. That gives an opportunity for slightly smaller scale conversations. So we'll do that for 20 minutes, possibly running to 25, seeing how those conversations are going. And then we'll come back all in together and have kind of reflections on what's happened in those breakout groups. And the last 10 minutes will be 5 minutes each, Ioan and David, for any kind of final concluding comments. And then we'll wrap up as normal at 7 o'clock. So at this point, I will pass to Ioan to start us off.
Great, thanks. I love that little conversation beforehand. I think that sounds more interesting than what I've got to say, so I'm quite happy to talk about that, but I'm not allowed to. So really nice to be here. Thanks for the invite. I'm really looking forward to this and the learning that I'll get out of this as well. So let's just go to a quick share screen now, and let's put that up. Just organize that. Can you all see the slides okay? Is that, yeah, great, thank you. Great, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a very large program research that we've got going through a number of institutions, including the University of York. You can see them there. And this is part of a UK-wide investment in about £45 million worth of research on transforming food systems in the UK. We're one of 4 very large projects, so this is about £6 million project. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And it has quite a lot of systems change sort of underlying features in it. So that's what I'll draw out. Essentially, I'm going to talk about food systems, but I'm not really going to talk that much about the systems themselves. It is all under, this whole project is all underpinned by this challenge that we have, that much of our food is highly unsustainable. We've got supply issues. It drives inequalities. It's got a huge bunch of issues around health. And so this challenge is then, how do we think about a food system? How do we even approach changing a food system? And the focus of Fix Our Food, and you can see lots more information on the website, it's just fixourfood.org. But the focus is on Yorkshire. So we're taking our system boundary, if you like, is Yorkshire, not just the Yorkshire counties, not just North Yorkshire, but Yorkshire as a whole. We see this as a complex system. And we're trying to work out how to even start entering that. But essentially, we've got 3 entry points into that system. So think 3 subsystems. One is, if I start with the bottom one, regenerative farming. That's really the production end. We've got the other end, which is the consumption end, the demand end, which is around schools and early years. We've got major issues in schools around diets, pupils' access to food, a whole bunch of issues around there. Just the time, you just think about this, you know, the time that is devoted to actually eating food as a social endeavor in schools is just stretched down to nothing almost now. And then the stuff in the middle, how do we create hybrid food economies, different kinds of businesses that are more purpose-led, that sort of thing, the entrepreneurial sort of space in between. And that's really the entry point into the systems work. I'm not going to go through all the details. There's lots of people doing amazing stuff, lots and lots of activities going on, working in schools, Leaders for Change, using kids for schools, working with farmers, doing high-level experiments on regenerative farming, all sorts of stuff going on that, frankly, I don't know the details and don't understand fully. But essentially, what we started off with was this sort of wheel on the left. And the first bit is that looking at from a system perspective, how do we understand this from a systems point of view? The lock-ins, barriers, the system change opportunities. There's a lot of work happening in that work package 2 space, the innovations. That's where the subsystems fit, stuff happening in schools. How do we get auto enrollment of pupils into free food? All that sort of work that's happening there, the farming systems, the economy stuff. There's a group working on metrics, sort of trying to work out how do we understand what transformation is from a metrics point of view. There's a whole bunch of work happening out of City University of London on policies and governance and what does that actually mean. The narratives has gone out the window. I'll talk about that in a minute because we've changed tack. And there's some work around system integration, which is challenging to do in the kind we've got. But there's lots of things happening in this big, large project. And I'm not going to go through all of it. What I'm going to talk a little bit is about that first bit, that first work package around how we started to approach thinking about food systems. So we're 3 years in now of a 5-year program. So we're 3 years in a 5-year program. Have we got a question there? No, it's just somebody's not on mute. That's okay. I'll carry on. But essentially, we're looking at this from a transformational perspective. So the classic analogy, caterpillar to a butterfly has a very different function, ability, and purpose to a caterpillar. So the caterpillar goes through a process of dissolution and the reallocation of resources to create something new. So it's that kind of notion that we're talking about. We're talking about a fundamental change. We're using 3 horizons, if you're familiar with that, as a futures method to help structure conversations and dialogue with multiple actors as a language to help us understand the kind of future that we're envisioning, the challenges we've got in the present, and then systemically, how do we work with things in the middle in order to stimulate a shift and a disruption. We're also using concepts we've developed around regenerative systems, seeing regenerative systems as those kinds of systems that where you would hope, for example, in a food system, that you would get not just a reduction of activities to a sustainable level, but really setting a set of dynamics and patterns where you'd get a spiraling up of human environmental benefit. That's at least one of the things we've been trying to work on and think in and bring into that, although it's not been straightforward because it's quite an abstract concept. This is just the outcome of actually the first bit where we used 3 horizons. We worked in each subsystem, multiple workshops in each subsystem, total of about 120 people involved in the 3 horizons work generally, and lots of other people involved in different ways. This is just the summary of really what we came to. There's thousands of items underpinning these, where we got to in these clusters. So this is just a pattern of how we've envisaged it. And I'm not going to go too much in detail there, but you can see these 6 domains that we're seeing as a system. If we can get the action working within each of those action domains as a system, and between them, we have a chance to be able, we think we have a chance to be able to really start supporting a systemic shift and change. So that's really the kind of outcome of that first piece of work that we've worked in. Going forward, the stuff I'm taking on, I mentioned I'm not dealing with narratives anymore. We shifted entirely, but now I'm working with North Yorkshire Council to really take them through a strategy development for their own system change process. And there's a whole bunch of activities working in there. We've got the transformational strategy we've run a bunch of facilitated meetings with them about that, similar 3 horizons type stuff. We've just started some work on, okay, if we're going to get the system change, how do we need to transform how we think about governance? Somebody else working on, well, if we're going to do some system change, then what kinds of transformative modes of evaluation do we need that will actually stimulate a shift and drive a shift, rather than just being a summative evaluation of what's happening? And now we've just decided, actually, we need to just get started with the action, because that needs to feed in and inform the other things, and vice versa. So it's kind of this really messy space of multiple actors. We're fortunate we've got a brilliant partner who's just super keen on all of this and is willing to really go through the thinking processes to support that, which is sometimes difficult to pull on board. Going forward from that, then there's also what we found in that, lots of activities happening. So for example, in Sheffield, we started with the action and it was just about bringing multiple actors together in all of Sheffield and just starting to think about what is already happening that we can just draw on. So 73 major actions identified by people already doing it. So just starting to see it as a system rather than starting with some big conversation about goals and systems change and all that sort of thing that's coming together. As I said, working towards free school meal auto enrollment. I think one of the big things that we've just also established is we recognise at a system level in Yorkshire, we didn't really have a client. We had nobody to go to who was looking at things at that level. So we created it. So we created what we're now calling Fix Our Food Commission. We've just finalized who's going to be on that. It's about 10 very influential people with super networks and links into all sorts of different levels and different kinds of people and networks that are already happening. And I'm starting to see that as almost the client from which we will then expand out and start working with. So again, further supporting that through systems change type workshops and so on as well, and helping them. But they're very keen on action. The chair that we've chosen and to help us establish that is a guy called David Kerfoot, who's basically, he just wants action, and that's great because we can actually get that stuff driving. But again, it's almost like that client at a high level who's willing to take accountability for looking at this at a whole system level, and then starting to find the networks and actors to start bringing them together for the action that might come out from that. So really just a few reflections. There's lots of different reflections I can come into. Some of this will be familiar to you, but the biggest challenge I think we've had certainly from my perspective in the program is that this is a research program. It started off as a research program. We wouldn't have got the money without it. And yet what we really want is action. So it's been a real challenge for many involved to step out of that role as researcher into more as an action sort of driver type thing from which research might support it. So we've had to blur roles. I've stepped in as facilitator. I've got some brilliant PhD students who've been very willing to step out of that normal role. And as they say to me, they're not really understood in our department because of the way they're engaging so much with action and supporting. And that's really interesting. I find that when I get confused, it's really helpful to ask who do I serve? And that's why in my mind, a sort of client of some kind is really helpful because you know who you're working for, you know what you're supporting, rather than it being a research for research sake, it's research for a particular purpose. And then it helps you to shift those roles in engaging with that. We've been continuously pushing for more holistic perspectives, but we struggle with that. And you know, the ways in which research is set up just it doesn't easily support that in an easy way. And then of course we're both dancing at the edge of both action and reflexivity all the time. It's difficult to bring people together and try and find ways of doing that. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is this. It feels to me like we're continuously bouncing in and out of what might be termed a first order and second order mode of research. Now, the idea of second order research came out of cybernetics. So I'm hoping some of you might be familiar with that. But my understanding of that is really just this notion that recognizing or breaking or stepping away from the assumption that good research comes from standing from the outside looking in and recognizing you're part of the system, and therefore the way in which you're observing it is affecting how you deal with it, and that actually research in itself is a form of intervention anyway. So it comes back to a choice of what kind of intervention do you want. And in our case, if we want system change, we're not going to, traditional research is not going to be enough in order to be able to support that. So that was really just some reflections on dealing with it. I haven't talked much about food systems per se, but it's in this context of something that is messy, big, amorphous, very difficult to understand, inherent power system structures within this that are really, really challenging to deal with. But at least we're having a go and finding ways of cohering lots of people together in what I hope is a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ioan. Brilliant and bang on timing. Exactly 12 minutes. Perfect. So David, we'll pass to you now. Just while David's setting up, just one thing I forgot to mention in the intro is after David's presentation, we'll ask Mike Vernon, who's on the line with Isabel, just to give us 5 or 10 minutes of reflections on the two presentations as a primer before we go into the breakout rooms. So David, we'll pass the floor to you now.
Great, thanks. I'll try to keep to time as well. I'm going to give a high-level perspective on the global food supply system, the problems with it, and some possible routes to improving it. My background is actually very different. It's from structural engineering design and stress analysis, but in the past couple of years at ARUP, I've been researching into the global food and agriculture systems and looking for some of the high-tech foods and food system in terms of the farming system. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. And learning about cybernetics really for the first time to some extent, obviously it concerns diverse inputs and their feedback loops. Taking the global food supply system, this is an example where humans control a lot of the inputs. The outputs that we're observing have been proven to have some negative consequences. And the opportunities that we have to change those inputs based on the outputs are often being ignored. So the feedback loops of this food system are not happening in an optimal manner, as is how I see it. So some of these inputs then, one thing in particular which stands out a lot is the amount of land area that the earth uses for agriculture. And it's 50% of our habitable land at this moment. And you can see roughly from where my mouse is going on the screen that it's a big increase over the past few hundred years. A lot more land is being used for grazing and crops. And similarly, of all of the fresh water that we use as humans, 70% of that is within agriculture. So that's a lot. And we can ask some questions about what are we growing, plants versus livestock? Are we growing them in an urban environment or rural, domestically, or importing them? Oh, sorry. And are we growing with traditional methods or high-tech methods? How much land area, water usage, antibiotic usage, pesticides, herbicides are we using? These are all of the inputs that we have some control over. And one point that I think is always worth highlighting is that animal agriculture tends to be the worst overall. So in terms of metrics around greenhouse gas emissions and land area and also water usage, tends to be that the animal agriculture ones are the worst. So we should, to some extent, focus on those as key opportunities to improve those metrics. And it's interesting that one thing I found out was that only 23% of the plant crops that we grow are actually eaten by humans. A lot of them are eaten by, most of it is eaten by animals in the livestock industry and some for biofuel, but very small amount of our, only about 25%, only about a quarter is actually eaten by humans directly. So I think there's an opportunity there. So these negative consequences, 33% of greenhouse gases are food related. We have biodiversity loss, of which 80% can be attributed to farming. All of these articles around pollution that's coming from fertilizers being used in crop fields, and when that gets into the waterways and into the soil, it causes a lot of damage and harms the ecosystem. And similarly, with regards to growing food and where we grow it, we often, and especially after the pandemic and times like this where we were relying on imports, and we found that the supply chain would quickly break down if we were relying too much on long supply chains for our food. And it's also an important stat that about 30% of all the food that we grow is wasted and it never gets eaten. So there's opportunities here to improve the system, I think. At one of the recent biodiversity COP conferences, they made a pledge that 30% of our Earth's land would be reserved for nature. And that should really be a minimum, I think. It's about trying to stop agriculture taking over nature altogether, I think. And some of the solutions that have come up in various research and business efforts include vertical farming. Bradford, Sheffield, they've had some various projects going on researching into this. There's been articles around how old coal mines could be really good for growing crops and things like mushrooms in particular, which don't require light, and then other types of crops as well can be make use of those spaces. And in Italy, there's been a lot of really large-scale indoor vertical farming projects happening, and the same can be said in other parts of the world as well. Really close to where I live in Birmingham, there's a new project being confirmed for growing, having a rooftop farm on an old car park, and lots of small local system solutions like this will keep cropping up. And in terms of tackling animal agriculture, there's a lot of promise around lab-grown meat. So this is a very much established, not established new technology that's in development, but definitely something to look out for and take seriously into the future. We talk about the kind of different levels of technology in farming, and high-tech greenhouses are pretty well established. Vertical farming is getting pretty well established these days, and culture meat's really the next big technological leap that once gets approved in more countries could be a big commercial thing. And I was co-author on a ARUP publication last year called Repurposing Buildings for Farming. And what this basically looked at was how do we take our various abandoned buildings in basically all of our cities and help to bring food closer to consumers by repurposing those and also saving our heritage at the same time. Vertical farming in particular has various benefits, and it's much more efficient in terms of land use and water usage. You have a lot of strong control over the flavor, yield, and nutrition of the crops at the end of it, because you can control what you feed it basically. And we don't risk polluting our soils and waterways because it's a fully enclosed indoor system. And also with a 365-day consistent growing capability, and the fact that you have so much control over the inputs that you have a very reliable crop at the end of it. The negatives are that it's still takes a lot of energy to run the controlled environment compared to other traditional methods, and commercial viability is very strong for certain types of crop, but then some of the staple crops like wheat and barley and potatoes and things, they take a lot more energy, so that's typically not viable at the moment. Although it technically is feasible, it has been done. And so with repurposing buildings, we just sort of talk about different categories of buildings. So this is one where it's an abandoned warehouse, and the whole warehouse would be planned to be used purely for growing in high intensity industrial capacity. And then another idea is something like a abandoned shopping center, where you might have underground growing areas and then supporting retail and restaurants above. So it's more of a hybrid solution. And sometimes you have things like offices and other types of building where you just have some unoccupied space. A rooftop would be a good example, where there might be potential for greening the roof with some farms, or maybe even a greenhouse if the building can support it. And this has various social and food provision benefits. And then the idea of being able to save our heritage. There's a lot of historic buildings that are either at risk of demolition or have already been demolished, and how good it would be to save a lot of our industrial factories and mill buildings from previous centuries and bring them into the new, make them useful again for the future, and also draw in tourists as well to appreciate our heritage and teach them about new food technologies. And the way I crudely see our food system at the moment is we grow a lot of stuff in the field and not that much indoors, and we know how many of the crops are used for the livestock, and then these three new food technologies are very under-established. And there's no numbers on this. This is very indicative of approximate trends, and the idea, as I see it, to perhaps have a slightly more sustainable shape to the overall food system in the future would be to bring down some of these field farming numbers and increase the amount that's happening indoors. And certainly lab-grown meat has the potential to put a massive dent into the amount of effort and energy and land that's being used for where we get our meat from. And with all of this potential for reducing the amount of farming that's happening outdoors, this is where we can free up a lot of space for rewilding and otherwise bringing nature back into our rural areas. And so this is a bit of a vision as I see it, and it's obviously a very complicated and complex system. So be very interested to hear people's discussion on this as we proceed. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. Just rattled through my slides there. Thank you, Jonathan.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Great. So yeah, thank you both, Ioan and David. And at this point, we'll pass to you, Mike, to just give us a few reflections on that before we go into the breakout groups. Oh, we can't hear you, Mike. Is it just me?
No, can't hear Mike. Interesting discussions, though. Interesting presentations. Brilliant, actually.
Yeah, really good.
So we'll give Mike a moment.
Yeah, it's really great having two different angles on the same question. It's really good.
There was a bit of overlap, but not that much, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots to discuss there, but I mean, one reaction while we're waiting for Mike, but I was thinking as you were talking, David, that where I live in the Peak District of the UK, I mean, a lot of the land is kind of neither wild nor productively farmed. It's kind of farms, but it's green fields. You know, it doesn't seem to my eyes to be producing very much. I'm right, aren't I? That effectively what's happening there are agricultural subsidies are just keeping the farms as green fields rather than anything useful either to nature or to the food supply.
I think redirecting government subsidies will be very important in triggering some change to happen. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe you're talking about more grazing land, are you? Yeah.
Yeah.
But
It's not uncommon that around 30% of the farm economy is based on subsidies, and increasingly it's directed through ELMs and other systems towards that kind of farming, which is also at the same time nature generative and oriented towards producing carbon sinks.
Very interesting. Thank you both. Very interesting.
Yeah, so the shift in the subsidies is quite significant. It's going to shift away from smaller scale sort of subsidies for things towards sort of public good, like, as you say, carbon sinks and flood storage capacity, that sort of thing as well. But I'm doing some work with Natural England at the moment, who provide a lot of the advice in these processes and deliver some of these schemes, and they're really struggling to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't get farmers trapped in huge amounts of admin and bureaucracy of doing it. You know, my parents have got a small farm. They've got to write a 60-page, they've got to go through a 60-page contract for £1,900 a year under the current scheme. So just a huge amount of bureaucracy and red tape around doing it as well. So it's a big systemic issue in terms of those sorts of things as well.
I think that's where, you know, that's this kind of thing where AI might be actually useful as a technology, because we do have a bonkers system in terms of the cost. It a lot depends what kind of farm you are. If you're already organic, for example, doing regenerative things, it becomes a lot easier just to keep ticking boxes and get paid for doing what you were already doing. And the general picture is that you cut out costs so that the whole economy, you've got a completely different farm economic model for the farm. But are we just filling in time till somebody else?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll have a go, Jonathan. If Isabel did report issues with Zoom earlier.
We've
so what I was
got Mike on my phone, so I have done this before. So
does it work?
Go on, Mike. If you say something, Mike, we'll see if everybody can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hooray, thank you. Well, as I was saying earlier, albeit silently to you, my name's Mike Vernon. Some of you have encountered me before. On behalf of everybody, can I firstly say I found both those presentations, albeit coming from different angles, immensely enjoyable. And what was clear from both our presenters, from my point of view anyway, was that you have a passion for, a belief in something needs to be done, and you're clear about something needs to be done that is to the benefit of the planet, to the ecosystems that are affected, and to humanity who consumes the outputs. I particularly liked the use of indoors versus outdoors and rewilding, because there's an awful lot on the global scale. There's an awful lot of indoors which is actually falling into disrepair. So there's a number of opportunities to go global with food productions into locations and environments which historically may have been difficult to produce food. But my comments here are more to do with cybernetics than they are to do with your presentation. So let me just put my credentials on the table. My view of cybernetics is very simple. I look at the world as a set of interconnected and interacting feedback loops with nodes of possibility, which if I intervene into those nodes, I can affect the whole system. So what I do is I look for bang for the buck, namely what is the nature of the intervention into this system that is low cost, but maximum impact on the overall process so that the outputs are achieved beneficially. So that handles one of the governance agendas, because people always with the use of power come from the point of view of cost benefit. How much is it going to cost me? What am I going to get in return? And will this advance my political status in this location? The one thing I would say is, based on the thinking about interconnected feedback loops and looking at how the parts relate to each other, each presentation came, and I agree 12 minutes isn't a long time. But if you take a look at the solutions that you're offering through the presentations that you're making, each one of the needs for those solutions has got a history. So, for example, low diversity in one of your slides, Ioan. Low diversity. How did that low diversity get created by the way we currently do things? Who were the players in that? What was the politics of it? What were the economics of producing low diversity in the ecosystem when we all know that diversity is inevitably a requirement for future ecosystem health and human health? And it leads me to a question which is to do with, what is the meaning of food anyway? Is it a business opportunity? Is it a global lever to pull for the better use of location and resources? Is it a health creating thing? What is it? What is the meaning of food? Because unless we understand what the meaning of food is, I mean, at the moment, we're ending up with not just poor environments through the production systems, but we're also ending up with obese and cancer-ridden patients who are a function of the way in which things have been done. So what I would sort of say from the cybernetic point of view is the interconnection between the parts, the biography of how we got to the present conditions, because as a mathematician, I always look at what are the starting conditions here. The transformative thing needs a metaphor, and I quite like the idea of, say, nature, if we're talking about food, as a way of turning worms into robins. The process of turning something into something else as a transformative action requires an understanding of all the contributions to the interconnected feedback loops and where the appropriate interventions manage to produce either more robins or more worms, or a better process of turning those worms into robins. So I hope that helps, because my last point on this before we move to the breakout rooms is, please be careful when you go into the breakout rooms. Do you want to discuss the content of the slides, or do you want to discuss the impact that those presentations have had on you? And if you want to discuss the impact that those presentations have had on you, how does it affect the way in which you look at the world through the cybernetic lenses that we all support? We need more requisite variety in order to get things done better. So again, thank you. And that, from a cybernaut's point of view, is my summary.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you, Mike. That's great setup for the breakout conversations. Right. So what I'll do now, I'll use the random function. I'll put us in 3 groups. I'll remain in the main room. If the randomness, we end up with all the presenters in one group, for instance, then please use the return to the main group and we'll do a bit of reallocation. And presenters, you're more than welcome to, and Mike, you're more than welcome to float. So if after halfway you want to come back into the main room, go to a different group, that's fine. Just return to the main room and I'll reallocate you. Right, so let me hit the more button and allocate you all. My more button's gone. There we go. Okay, breakout rooms. 3 breakout rooms. Okay, I shall hit the button. See you in 20 minutes or earlier if things go wrong. Yeah, it's back. Yes. I know Chris Heald's had to leave us for another appointment. I think we're all back now. I think if we do it in the way we've done it historically, so people raise the hand using the kind of function in Zoom, and Mike and Peter, if you could help with facilitation, that would be excellent. So I think it's pretty much open forum. So anybody want to go first with reflections? Yeah, go on, Miguel.
So Ioan was in our room with Malcolm and Bruce, and we left with a great deal of uncertainty about what to do. There doesn't seem to be any clear-cut answer. There's a lot of factors that for example, in Ioan's case, and his students, his candidates are trying to figure out. And that remains to me, I think, one of the biggest problems. There's no, it's such a monster with so many arms and so many tentacles, that it seems to be difficult to say, hey, this seems like a good segment to take on and then go from there. Very pessimistic comment, but I think it's also good to have a certain level of realism.
Mm.
Go on, Vanilla.
We came down. Oh, have I? Yeah, right. We came out with a way of simplifying the problem by encouraging the populace to become vegan. It's effective, it's simple, it's healthy, and that 68%, was it, of grain cost for keeping animals alive that we don't need would be resolved. But then, as one of our team pointed out, we are actually generating enough food to feed the planet. At the moment, the issue is one of distribution. So that's enough from me.
Mm. If I come in, because I think that's very interesting, both responses so far, but I think I'm going to just quote Angus, and Angus said, ecology is cybernetic. And I thought that was really interesting. So ecology is cybernetic, and then in the sense of whether we get kind of viable and meaningful outcomes out of that or not seems to depend on the kind of frameworks applied around it. So I'm going to try and develop a slightly more optimistic thesis than Miguel, which is that ecology is cybernetic, but we recognize, and this was the kind of discussion, that the different economic assumptions drive towards ecology or drive towards a kind of an unnourishing landscape of poor natural production, and different economic assumptions can make a difference to that. Also, different models applied by the retailers can make a difference to that, positively or negatively. By the public can make a difference to that, positively or negatively, and by the farmers themselves. So in a sense, when we see the kind of cybernetic ecology at the center of the diagram, and as we kind of inquire into, in a sense, let's take that word, its viability, its variety and its viability, then the answer to driving that towards a kind of viability is probably in the economic assumptions, the retailers' models, the public's understanding the narrative point that Ioan was making, and the views of the farmers themselves. And so it seems like that's the population we need to make think in the right way, and then the ecology will follow. As Angus was prompting me, it matters what worlds.
Peter, you left out the actual ecologists and environmentalists who need to inform the farmers and the supermarkets of what the actual necessary underpinnings would be for a more sustainable system to be able to happen. At least I didn't hear that part. No,
you're right, Margaret. You're right. I think you're right. There's more to elaborate this model. You're right.
Yeah. So what's also quite interesting, I come from a family of farmers in Africa, Irish farmers in Africa, and I was very involved in the permaculture process in using urban open space in South Africa for many years and taught permaculture design. And that's for smaller spaces, obviously, not for huge, big farms. But one thing that struck me when somebody spoke earlier about these green deserts we've got here in the UK is that if you just took out the fences and allowed the tagged, beasts of the field, so to speak, to roam and created more intercropping and, more layers, more diversity in sections, you could still move from pasture to pasture, except you're no longer just working as a single farm bounded and then having to actually feed your cows grain and soy, which they should not eat, which causes insulin resistance in the animals and makes the omega-6, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule, up to 30 times higher in this kind of feedlot-fed animal meat. So there are huge costs to the human body of this kind of farming. So if you went back to grass-fed, for example, natural a cow's actual natural food, and changed the structure slightly by perhaps working collaboratively, removing some of the fencing, you would be able to get movement as in nature does of the actual animals. And I think just this kind of thinking helps to open up possibilities for economic models for certain aspects of a person's farming portfolio, for example, of the food production portfolio, which might change the dynamics a bit, would obviously change the economics a bit, would change the land use management a lot, and allow for better diversity. So that's also another way of looking at things. And that's once again a social project, not just an economic one.
Yeah, I think you've
changed approaches, mental models.
Yeah, I think by highlighting mental models and this idea of social process, you've done a better job than me, Margaret. I think that's where I was trying to go, and elaborating the model like that is very powerful. My understanding is frankly not enough. I'm confessing to be a boy from Wally Range, Manchester, but
no, it's not enough. No, it's not enough.
I grew up one street down from Moss Side, Manchester, so that's my get out close here. But that is magnificent to be kind of sharing this knowledge. Just as sorry for the segue, but William Blake's Jerusalem is often read as a kind of protest against enclosure and that kind of movement. It's like that kind of, there was a knowledge of the harm that was being done.
Yeah.
There was a knowledge, and I think perhaps we then gotten used to it until these kind of negative externalities eventually come out of the system. The system doesn't die quickly, it dies slowly, and eventually we see it. And that's the position we're in now.
I appreciate very much what you were saying, Margaret, and what you've just been saying, Peter. If I take a step back from that, and in order to come back to it, I don't see that the solution is a technology one. I think that the solution is a biological one and an issue of technique. It's about not different technologies, but different techniques on the farm. And those techniques are those which encourage the healthy biology and ecology of the farm. And that's a learning curve for many farmers who have, over the decades, through the grant system and through the education of advisors and so on, and the whole model of the world towards produce more food, which goes back to things like in the Second World War, the real feeling that the British would lose the war if they didn't produce enough food, for example, that it was a crisis. So I think that I certainly think that there is room for converting some buildings into places where things get grown, but I don't think that's the solution to the problem. I think that vegan is not the solution to the problem either, and I declare an interest by being a vegetarian for 50 years. The reason I don't think that vegan is the solution is because it's really important to have animals on a farm. Animals manure the farm, and they're absolutely vital to the processes of healthy soil. And healthy soil is the bedrock of it all. It's really, really healthy soil is what solves this problem. It's what sequesters carbon,
The greatest
what
carbon
generates life.
aside from the ocean. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got so many, the list of ecosystem benefits that it gives and social benefits from healthy soil is quite extraordinary. And the amount of life that it can support and transform is really also extraordinary. You've got to think of soil as a living thing, and that most of the soil on our farms is almost dead or dead. It's really tragic. And that means that the whole structure of the soil, and therefore things like the ability to conserve water, is destroyed.
More floods, less rain catchment, less diversity, more topsoil being washed away every year, less clean water.
Yes. And
less
if you take practical,
you know, all of that, less rain. Yeah.
Take some practical examples. If you're rearing a 1,000 kilo Holstein cow, which is so heavy that you can't actually walk about in the field without it being in danger of falling down and breaking its hips. So you keep it inside the barn all year round, and then you feed it. And in its short milking life, it produces six times its own weight. Six times its own weight in milk. That's a really unhealthy system, and you need to produce intensive food to feed it. So that is the unhealthy thing. If instead, as been said, as you were saying, Margaret, if the animals return to the land, and indeed you mix them, so you can have pigs in the woods, the animals, sheep, pigs, so on, cows, will sort out the plants you don't want to have, and they'll sort out the ones that they do want to have. They will improve the ecosystem. And if you bring the right amount, so you don't want, the point is we try to run too many, and then we can't keep them on the land. So we have breeds that cannot survive during the winter. So we have to put them in barns. So then we have to spend a lot of money on the barns and managing them.
It's a factory version of, it's a factory model for farming, living.
It's industrialized farming.
Yeah.
So what we need to do is get back to an ecological model of farming, and then that would change things. And then part of that is then to say, what constitutes healthy food? What does healthy food look like? That's an education problem.
Well, I think sorry if I may just pop in this healthy food thing. What really struck me is that both models were looking at this thing that food can't be free. That was really weird for me, that we've gotten so used to this idea that you can't just stroll along your street and pick off a couple of apples if you want to, or take some herbs, or, you know, your spinach or whatever you want to. And there are many places in the world where they now do this mixed urban farming model very successfully. But it is really interesting for me that neither model that was presented had some of that aspect to it that I could see, at least.
And I'm just sorry, I'm on multiple speakers and screens trying to sort my technology, but I think related to that, Margaret and Peter, kind of, I was triggered by your beautiful artistic reference. I think what's also struck me is how removed we are from our food system, and how removed we have made ourselves from nature. And I think that's actually the emotional piece that sits underneath what you're saying as well, Angus, is, you know, it's not just education, it's about how we, you know, we are also food. And it's, you know, we nourish ourselves with food. It's not just like a chemical reaction that happens. And so, you know, I was saying in our breakout group, I think the idea of vertical farming is really exciting because it's suddenly bringing something creative and life-giving into a city where it wasn't before. And there's also this kind of idea of like, how can we be generous back to nature? And a farm isn't, you know, as traditionally defined as it once was. So I think, yeah, Margaret, really get your point there, about how amazing would it be to like walk in Hyde Park and be able to pick your apples, and you would feel so differently about the soil. You would relate to it in such a different emotional way as well as a kind of technical way.
Or plant the edges of roads with apple trees.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic.
There's a notion of a community
cherries or
orchard, and there are subsidies for community orchards.
Or go scrumping for mealies in the fields in South Africa.
Or Zimbabwe.
Or sunflowers.
I think one of the problems where my sister lives down in Kent, they had I think it was apples this time, but there's a lot of fruit in Kent, and sometimes there's more than the people who have the farms are going to pick. So it would make sense to go out and let people, after they've harvested what they want, to let people take the rest. Talking to my sister, one of the big issues with it, as you could probably guess, is insurance. You're on somebody's land, you do this, you fall over, the farmer doesn't,
Nonsense. It's
so
such nonsense.
there are structures around the discussion, the things we're discussing, that would have to be either changed or put in place, depending what they are. That means that people don't say, you know what, it's just going to have to rot because I don't want the hassle of defending an insurance claim.
Or bring the pigs over to eat the apples.
Or bring the pigs.
Can I just say that these are all nice ideas, and I definitely agree with a lot of them, but there are some things that I don't think are entirely realistic, and especially the idea of the grass-fed animal thing on a large scale. There's simply not enough land for that, which is part of the problem, right? Because I think at the moment, I'm not sure the exact percentage, it's well over half, possibly 90% of all animals for livestock are being bred and raised either indoors or on these large livestock land where there's no grass anywhere. They're just fed and then slaughtered, right? So, and if we were to, the problem is and it is a bit of a problem, and it speaks to my next question. But if our demand for meat has been increasing many-fold over the past few decades, and it continues to increase, to be honest. So the only way at the moment that we're able to sustain that is with this intensive factory farming. No one really likes it, but it's the only way it works. If we were to do the grass-fed thing, not only would we have to keep chopping down the Amazon rainforest, we'd probably have to flatten, we'd probably have to destroy most of the wild land we've got just to
David,
extend.
I don't think that actually stands up. I don't think the data works like that. The reason I don't think it's like that is because it starts with a certain premise that the model would carry on. If instead what you say is the global north eats too much food, and in particular it eats way too much meat. So the amount of meat that we're producing, especially in the global north, is more than we really need by a large factor, by a very significant factor. So supposing you halve it, then what you're starting with is still plenty of meat for people, because you actually don't need to eat any meat at all in order to have a healthy diet. It's not, you can, but you don't have to in most people. So you could radically reduce the amount of meat that people eat. And you can produce that if you, therefore, what you do is you keep enough animals, you have a much more, a form of intensive. It's the form of intensive in which what you're doing is you're running mixed activity. You're putting trees amongst arable crops. You're putting plants growing down your orchards. You are putting animals onto the farm. And what you are doing is you're creating not just grass, but a mixed meadow lay, which has got pulses, which has got for nitrogen, which has got medical foods, which has got nutritive foods, foods for insects and so on, particular plants that dig down deep to be able to go and get carbon and so on. So if you have those mixed and you've got animals that are living on those, and we lived on that, if we lived on what was sustainable and said, how many animals can we sustain in a healthy farming ecology? And we live on that. We can easily feed ourselves. It's not a problem. So instead of saying, what we do is we say, we want to eat too much of the wrong kind of food, therefore we have to destroy the planet. It doesn't work.
But what's interesting is my great-grandparents used to eat meat once a week. And they lived till like 85 and 96 or something, I mean, and on both sides, they didn't have meat every day. They had fish perhaps once a week, if they could get it. They might have had the roast chicken on the Sunday or the piece of meat. And the rest of the time it was beans and, mixtures of vegetables and all sorts of things like that. But that's what they lived on. But from the garden, and they might have had milk or cheese, yes, eggs, yes. So I'm just saying that perhaps part what we're talking about here is maybe instead of trying to replicate what we've got right now, maybe part of the shift we're talking about is actually a cultural shift to re-education of what a human body actually needs and where it gets its protein.
Thank you. There's a
yeah,
couple of reflections I just wanted to give, but just before I do that, David, any thoughts or reflections on the input you've just had from Angus and Margaret?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, it is a human psychology thing as well. We've become accustomed to the lifestyle that we've got. So it's all very well saying we used to eat meat once a month, and now people are expecting to eat meat 3 times a day. At least a lot of people are. I mean, I'm not, because I'm coming from the vegan brigade or whatever, but in general, that I'm not expecting that people's meat consumption is going to massively reduce. That seems like a massive challenge to try and do. So if we are saying that the system of creating meat is bad for various reasons, then that's where I think more so than vertical farming, the idea of cultured meat has a big potential to impact that. Now, okay, at the moment it's quite energy intensive, but that can decline. But the fact that you can give people the amount of meat that they want without taking up the land that we currently do to create that meat, and the associated land for the crops that feed the animals and the associated emissions of those animals, all of this stuff. And okay, you're talking about the mixed use farming, which having great animals on the soil to make the soil better. But some of the research I've said that if you keep moving the animals around, eventually the soil will continue to slowly degrade, unless you've well, the soil quality will reduce as over time. And if you don't have more and more land to keep moving them to, right?
It doesn't work. No, that's not how it works
Like that.
Can you explain what you mean?
Tony,
I don't really want to get bogged down in all of these points, but maybe I've got that slightly wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Can I make a point also? I mean, I think these solutions, I think we would all go with one or more of these solutions that we've heard proposed. Would a lower class family who's trying to meet, their budget on a daily basis, what's the argument for them to switch? What's the compelling argument to get people to understand this and say, you know what, this is a really big deal. Let's change this.
There's a lot cheaper diets.
I don't hear that.
I think
there's really cheap diets.
I think
much cheaper diets.
But the meat, I think David's meat example is clear. There are a lot of people who eat meat. They don't think twice about it. They would get freaked out.
Dense, right? It's nutrient dense. It's easy. It's an easy nutrient dense single source for what you would have to substitute many other species for.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm not disagreeing with the idea that there's a cultural and behavioral change. All I'm saying is that human beings are good at achieving cultural, and cybernetics is about that. I remember when nobody, no, we can't have seatbelts. No. And now nobody even dreams of driving without a seatbelt. No, we can't get rid of cigarettes in pubs and so on. And guess what? People are really happy that there are no cigarettes in pubs for the most part. So a transformation can be achieved when it's seen in a different way. That's about that's a cybernetic challenge.
Malcolm was trying to come in, I think, as well.
Well, it's interesting that last point, and also just looking in the chat. One of the things, I mean, someone just mentioned George Monbiot about this cybernetic challenge. You can see it also as a political challenge. I mean, one of the things that I find depressing, it's this idea of everything being interconnected and nested systems. I mean, talking of George Monbiot, there's an article, I'll put a link in the chat in a minute, from last July, where he talks, the name of the article I think is quite interesting. He says, with our food systems on the verge of collapse, it's the plutocrats versus life on Earth. So what you've got here is a kind of like an ideological hegemony, and no one's talking about that really.
Yep.
On the other extreme, literally 2 minutes ago, checking my emails, I got an email from Sainsbury's offering a £3 meal deal for 2. Now, with the current, again, ideological hegemony, think of the cost of living crisis, hardworking families, all these things we take for granted as normal, as common sense. Those £3 meal deals are probably really a lifesaver, except it's ultra-processed poison that's probably going to kill you. And then, of course, it was actually kind of like Brexit. Think of what Brexit was all about and the ideological ideals underpinning that. That's all about getting rid of labeling, getting rid of controls, getting rid of stuff. So that, you know, I'm a meat eater, but I'm going to have to be hyper vigilant now to make sure I don't get hormones in my beef. So the thing is, right, is that we've got this wider political set of hegemonic ideas, so that when we sit here saying this is possible, we should be doing this, this is what we need, I for one can't see it happening.
Yeah,
I agree. It's a problem.
Mike, go ahead. Oh, sorry,
Yes.
Jonathan.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah, Mike, I think, Ioan, you wanted to come in a bit earlier. Do you want to go or let Mike go first?
Mike, I can go in.
Yeah,
don't mind.
Yeah.
Well,
Mike, do you want to
you come in after me, Ioan, yeah? Because I'm actually going to quote you, really. Which is, I was much struck by the idea of a meaningful way forward, and the action that's needed to represent that meaningful way. And also by David's proposition that human beings control the inputs. The difficulty that I think we have at the heart of every cybernetic system, and I think Malcolm's onto something here, is that there is a philosophical proposition. And I was much struck by Peter's assertion that cybernetics is the practical philosophy of this century. And the difficulty that we're facing is that not only is there a philosophical proposition at the heart of every system which drives how it is constructed, legitimized, and operated, but also it is maintained by a few interested parties driven by self-interest. Now, I worked with Baroness Greenfield on the neuroscience of how we perceive and understand the worlds around us. Now, her contention would be that there is a problem in the inherited genetic structure of the human being called that we are committed to our own self-interest at the expense of the others around us. So if at the heart of the system, what we've got is a driven self-interest in a group of people who have the power structures, back to you, Ioan, have the power structures to make sure that their particular view of the world overrides everybody else, then we have to be very, very interested, I think, the rest of us, in how we find a meaningful way forward and what the right kind of intervention is. And I was much struck by your question, Ioan, which was, what kind of interventions do we want? Because we can all agree that these are the problems, these are the things that need to be dealt with, but there is history to how they've been created. And the history of how they've been created isn't understood and is invisible to most people, in the same way that the subsoil structures are invisible in the food production systems. So my issue would be, how do we get a different philosophical sense at the heart of the ecosystem called the cybernetics of food production and consumption? How do we get a meaningful proposition at the heart of that, which we can then use to persuade the control of the inputs, on David's point, and to construct and create a meaningful way forward, given the power structure's vested interest in maintaining the entropy of the ecosystem to reduce the requisite variety for human and other life, and really to take us into a direction which I think is quite bleak. Sorry about that, but that's the way I take it.
That's a really nice articulation. It was interesting, Mike, because I was about to quote you as well. Thank you. But yeah, that's a really nice articulation of the question, which I do actually agree is the really important one. We know there's lots of people who know about the problems, but just and picking up on that a little bit, I think, Mike, I was interested in your point about going back to that question of what is the meaning of food, because that's really key. It's that existential question that then drives how we conceptualize, how we approach, say, farming, which drives the practices and activities that we do. So that existential question is really key, and I hadn't quite really, until you'd said that, really got into think, okay, so what are we talking about when we're dealing with all these people who are trying to think about changing the system? But that's a really fundamental question to come back to, which then allows, I think, a better understanding or a better approach to saying, okay, so what do we do about it? And that relates a lot to what Miguel's saying, Malcolm's saying, and many others are saying in there as well about some of the challenges. So in Bradford, there are families, you know, who are very low income. You've got somebody working 3 jobs. They've got 4 kids. they haven't got any money, and yet all they can do, and they haven't got any time, they're knackered, and they go and buy, they see a chicken for £3 and a bag of chips. They can take that home, give it to the kids, and it fills them up and they feel better, right? It's not nutritious, but there's a huge reality there. So somebody in Bradford is trying to figure out how you can create the Brad burger, a cultural shift to thinking about, I can't remember if it's artificial meat or whether it's vegan or whatever it is, but they're trying to create and work with that. The other side of it is just the power in this system is just immense. And I'm just going to send you, it's a Guardian article, but it's actually a really good research paper. I'll find the link to the research paper in a minute, by somebody called Eric Lambin and others. And they actually analyzed the power of the meat industry system.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful. It's as big as the fossil fuel stuff. It's just, and they are driving the system.
And it's
just a
politically
massive
lobbied as smoking was.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a massive, massive vested interest in this. So we can talk about whether we, agree. Yeah, less meat. Definitely. I think that's the only way forward. Well, not the only way, but it's one of the really important ways forward. But we're fighting these very, very big challenges. So then it comes back to, so what is the meaning of food? Because in their system, the meaning of food is massive profit, right? And so then you have to tackle that question. But then that comes back to, so then what do we do about it? Because the power in the system is immense. But the one positive thing out of it, and it was interesting, Miguel, you're sort of saying that it was a negative. I don't quite see it as a negative. I see it as, how do we then start finding ways of working with the shifts that are happening? So the cost of fertilizers going through the roof. It's changing. Farmers are looking at it. I know farmers who are going to say, well, we can't buy feed. So then how do we start growing our own barley rather than just having lots of pasture land, right? So you're falling back into, okay, it's not perfect, but you're falling back into sort of more integrated ecological system farming as well. So there are massive opportunities that are coming. But what I feel we have to do is we have to get organized, being ready to help build the capacity to do that. And part of that is going back to these worldview questions and these helping, in very practical ways, individuals and groups to be able to organize and support and do all of that. I mean, one of the things that comments in our group that Bruce was talking about was just going to the Oxford Conference of Farming and just seeing the levels of innovation. It's just phenomenal. It's just phenomenal. So it's, how do we unleash all of that? How do we really build all that and start finding ways of doing it? To me, it's a sort of question. I don't like the word cohering because it suggests you can control stuff. You can't really control it. But how do we start working at that systemic level with multiple actors and finding ways to do it? I don't really know the answer. We're giving it a go, but we'll see where it gets to. But we are fighting some major power in the system.
It's a search process.
Sorry, I was going to say, can I ask? Not really asking you to answer the question, but we were. I think it was Angus was saying, we took smoking out of pubs. We took, drunk driving off the roads and so on. And that was a cultural shift that has happened in my lifetime, when it suddenly wasn't fashionable anymore to go around driving when you're, you have 5 pints of bitter or something. What was done then that convinced not just groups like this, where we're all interested, we all want to do the right thing, it's very academic, but actually the other 65 million people who need to be convinced in this country? Does anyone know what it was that triggered it? Was it attrition, that just gradually people moved? Because that might be part of the way. I mean, I agree with Miguel what he was saying earlier. It's fine. I mean, because I have my nephew is very ecologically sound, very, very interested. And he was trying to get me to spend £2.30 on some organic mushrooms rather than the £1.10 that had to be eaten today. Guess which ones I bought? I bought the £1.10 because I explained to him, if you can't feed your family, you're not interested in having a conversation about how good organic mushrooms are. And that, I think, so the first thing is, with the other big changes, how did that happen? Is there some learning there? And the second thing is, how do you bring everyone with you? Because if you don't bring people with you, it's not going to happen.
Get the women involved.
So one of the ways that the changes took place is they just passed a law. They passed laws and imposed that things had to be done.
So I say to you, poll tax, 1990.
Yeah, but the difference was that you actually got a large number of people supporting it. And when people started doing it, they found that they actually liked being in a pub that wasn't full of smoke. I want to just tell you the little story of sitting in a room with 10 farmers that was being organized by the NFU, local area in Gloucestershire. And I'm sitting in the room, and most of the time I'm listening. I've been introduced as to who I am. He's new, he's introducing himself. They're talking to each other about the issue. And what turns out is that half of them are really struggling. They're on the edge. There's a couple of them that are in danger of going bust. They are in severe anxiety mode. That's not at all unusual. They're really stressed. And the reason they're really stressed is because, for example, we have a councillor in the district who's lost an enormous amount of crop as a result of flooding this year. And with the costs that they're putting onto their farm and the economics, they're not actually making vast amounts of money. Unless you're huge, if you're huge, you make some money, but only wafer thin margins, which means if anything goes wrong, you're in real trouble. The land is of immense value, but the actual year-to-year model is
There's no robustness.
not profitable. So, but some of them were fine. Some of them were actually resilient, smiling, and making profit. And what were they doing? They were the ones who'd swapped over to regenerative farming models. So what's happening across the land is that farmers are changing anyway. And the reason they're changing is because they go bust if they don't.
Take a look at Jeremy Clarkson.
The challenge there, Angus, I'm sure you picked this up, is that the farmers we work with, and there's a group working with a lot of farmers, is they want to do it, but they A, don't know how, and B, it's a cost to do it. So they're trapped.
The knowledge is available. The knowledge is available. It's how do you open source it?
Well, it is, and it is. Yes, does that mean it's available or not? We know what to do. We know how to do it, but each farm is different, and it's a whole set of cultural shift or practice change. But
what
also,
you need is demonstration farms. So, for example, at the north of the Cotswolds, there's a demonstration farm that runs sessions every Friday with farmers coming, and they walk around it.
Sure.
They see what is actually going on and how it works.
But the biggest challenge that they tell us is the cost of shifting. It's not you can't just suddenly shift
and the labor.
And then how do you sustain yourself in a failing system at the same time as being able to shift to a new one? That's their biggest challenge.
The recommended path is to transition slowly.
Yes, but that's becoming harder and harder given the challenge that they've got of sustaining what they already have.
I agree.
So it's that. So that's the sort of thing that's happening. And yes, absolutely. And one of the things I would say is that work with the trend, as I said, like cost of fertilizer, whatever. It's actually helping to drive it. There was a really interesting farmer who's in Yorkshire, and he's really looked into regenerative farming. He really understands it, and it's really impressive because he actually, and I couldn't give you the argument, but he actually believes you can produce carbon negative meat, right? So he's been really looking. It's really fascinating. But one of the things he did is he's had to find some distributors who would want to pay the premium that would be needed to buy it. And so what happened was there's a chain down south called Honest Burgers that decided that they wanted to sell meat because that was what they got 30 restaurants, whatever it is. And they wanted to continue to sell meat, but they realized that there was a big challenge. They weren't just worried that people would not want to buy meat in future. They were worried that they wouldn't get enough chefs who would want to cook the meat. So they then found regenerative farmers that would actually do it. So it's that linkages, and it's really powerful when you hear those sorts of stories, because it suddenly starts to shift. Well, things are changing. The transformation's happening, whether we like it or not. It's inevitable. The question is, are we going to be able to get through it and transition through it in a way that, some things will disappear, things will emerge. But it's a question of how
there's no path for Britain to achieve net zero without sorting out farming. There's no path to achieve it. So it's only a matter of time before the government sets a rule that what the retailers have to do is demonstrate that the food that they are selling has a traceability all the way back to some kind of appropriate farming method that is on the right side of this equation. And that's already been talked about as to when it will happen. And there are already people like Waitrose, who are ahead of the curve, know that's coming and are already doing it with their farmers.
AI-enabled blockchain will help on the supply chains.
Interesting.
One of the things that's very useful as a construct in this entire problem set is to look at succession planning. And that's something that's often missed out because it will take you 8, anywhere up to 15 years to make this transformation. And farmers are used to thinking in long cycles. It's the other systems that move faster. And so you have to try and coordinate and work out where your log jams are going to be and where your lags are going to be, because you've got different rates of turnover of these different parts of the system. And so that succession planning, the tight coordination that's needed with everybody, you know, understanding how they fit in and what to expect. And that comes up with the system 3-star, which is your audit function needs to be able to capture how far towards or away from those longer term goals you might be at, and then how your coordination mechanisms are working, how your different delivery units, system ones we would call them, what channels need to be created between people, like between the burger people and the chefs and the farmers, for example, etc. So there are all sorts of interesting ways to think about that cybernetically, but one of the biggest problems is this timing issue, the coordination of these different timing processes.
Absolutely spot on.
Allowing enough time for some final comments. So maybe final comments if we go to you, David, first, and then Ioan, and then Mike, if you just give kind of final thoughts on the whole event. So
sure, this has been incredibly interesting, and just trying to absorb everyone's different arguments into my brain and come up with some kind of closing remarks. Yeah, no, I think it's good. I think some of us, we all have slightly different visions about what the future should be and what is the most positive approach to aim for. And I do remain quite skeptical about regenerative farming, not necessarily in concept, but in practicality, in terms of, I don't think everybody can do that because we run out of land, is the argument that I've read several times. And so if we want to, you know, eat to the amount of meat that we do at the moment, then I think the looking into the lab grown options will become very important in my understanding. And from cybernetic, we kind of have to look at the what are the boundary conditions of our problem? What constraints are we working within, and what are we willing to give up? What allowances are we willing to make for the system? Yeah, it's very complicated, and we didn't even talk about stuff like antibiotic resistance that comes from having animals in the system to such a large extent. We didn't talk about the oceans at all, because overfishing is also huge, and we didn't even touch on that as a whole other system that we just didn't have time for. Yeah, there's desertification.
Acidification of the ocean.
Acidification, yeah, exactly. I think what I was referring to earlier when you called me up, and the overgrazing thing, that can be avoided. But I think the point is, if everyone does regenerative farming, you just don't have more land to move animals onto, right? So that then the soils do suffer from that. And yeah, I have my opinions, and I think it's no obvious one answer. Having said that, it's important that we keep discussing it. I wanted to just paste into the chat the publication that I mentioned in my presentation. So if anyone's interested, feel free to have a read. It's just a sort of 20-odd page PDF about repurposing buildings for farming. And I do think that the repurposing buildings is a fairly small part of the overall solution. We're not going to move all of our farming to urban areas, even though there are benefits in terms of bringing it closer to people and making use of areas of our cities that aren't being used. The main thing is, how do we transform the countryside? And what do we care most about? Do we care most about preserving land? Do we care most about having the minimum electricity, energy costs? Do we care most about health? Do we care most about the planet? What are we optimizing the system for, basically? And I think everyone's going to have a slightly different answer to that.
Is that the right question?
Is what the right question? Sorry.
The optimization question, is that the right sort of question? Isn't that sort of the false, those are the false dichotomies we've been stuck in before?
In the interest of time, I'm the one word answer, David, go for it. Otherwise we'll move to Ioan.
I don't know is the answer. I don't know. We can keep discussing it in part 2, but no, we run out of time to come to an answer on that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, David. I'll build on that, David. I think you're right. There's just so many different ways of looking at it. It's a system problem, isn't it? You have different patterns and different things. And to me, it comes down to then the underlying dynamics of what you're trying to create. Is it a regenerative system, not just a regenerative farm, but is it a regenerative system? Is it supporting the scales above us and below us, whether it be a household up to a city or whatever it might be? Or is it actually degenerative, of which most of our systems are? So then I think the question for me then, I'm not going to say too much, but as I've said a lot already, but the thing I'm going to go away and think about is the meaning of food a bit again, because I think it's really struck me that existential question is really important. But then it then leads you to then, okay, if you want a different purpose of food or different purpose of food, different people, depending on what's going on, then it comes back to the question, well, how do we do about it? So much of my work in Fix Our Food is really about thinking, how do we convene people in the right way to get some shift happening, especially given the realities of how power is held in the system. So many other things in there, but I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's always a privilege to be able to speak more than others, which I've had that opportunity to do. So, so thank you, and David, I really enjoy your presentation. It's given me some food for thought as well. Excuse the pun, and I think I'll stop at that.
Brilliant.
How do we fix the food for thought problem?
Brilliant. Thanks, Yo. So Mike, and then maybe Peter, any closing comments at the end?
Or Isabel? Yeah. I'll just pick up on what Margaret just said about the false dichotomies of the past. They're driving us towards a kind of ecosystem entropy, which is a loss of diversity and the ability of the soil to produce foods. What I've appreciated very much is the sort of the different sort of contributions, which have particularly on water movement, Bill, etc. The way in which we sort of nourish the land with moisture and so on and so forth. It's kind of interesting for me to craft a viable system model in my head to find a meaningful way forward for myself in terms of the choices I'm making when I go into the supermarket or the garden or the hedgerow or the orchard or wherever it is. And I think in terms of where does action begin, it begins with me. I can't say others are at fault unless I, Mike, I'm setting an agenda, which is an example, a possible example. And through setting that agenda and taking those actions, can I use the feedback loop from the environment that I'm in to make my choices even better, to come to the point that David makes about optimizing? Because we have got no choice but to optimize within the context that we're in, the way in which we use resources to actually craft a better and more nourishing environment for food production going forwards. We have to nourish the social system, the political system, the economic system, and so on and so forth. That is a true cybernaut mission, and I sign up.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike.
Isabel, do you want to go next?
Peter, I'm very happy to pass to you because I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes left, and I think there's been a wealth of input already. But just to say, also Miguel, this was a really great first one on, this session, and it's been a real privilege to help organise it. So it's been lovely working with Miguel and Peter and Jonathan, and thank you, Ioan and David and Mike for joining us, as well as everyone else.
Yeah, that's great, Isabel, and thank you to you for your part in setting this up. Very quickly from me, where to start, but in a way I would say I don't feel I have that much knowledge, but I'm utterly persuaded by you all. And so it becomes this kind of question of how do we configure amongst the solutions? How do we configure it? And then something really remarkable happened as I was listening to Margaret and Mike and others among you is I began to hear you kind of doing live cybernetics, constructing VSMs as you spoke, and I began to feel the pieces coming together. So this kind of cybernetics live session that we've just invented, I thought it was utterly compelling, and I loved it, basically. And thank you so much for all your contributions. Absolutely loved it, utterly persuaded, and I'm going home hopeful.
Me too.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
It's amazing work you guys are doing. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
And thank you for taking the time to do this presentation and share that knowledge with us.
Thanks for the time to listening to it. That's good as well.
Yeah.
So, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It was really interesting to listen to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. Well, thank you all very much. That was brilliant. That's it.
Jonathan, shall we say that's a pass? Shall we say that's
Yeah. Yes. And there'll be our next event late February, early March. We'll be sending out more details in the next week or so in terms of the next one now in the series.
Look forward to it.
yeah, brilliant.
Brilliant.
so much.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.